Hello and welcome to the eOrganic webinar on organic blueberry production. My name is Alice Formiga and I'm the webinar coordinator for eOrganic. eOrganic is the organic agriculture community of practice with eExtension. We are a community of cooperative extension service personnel, researchers, ag professionals, organic certifiers, and practitioners. You will be able to find the recording of this webinar, information about our upcoming webinars, as well as articles, videos, and more by going to our website at www.extension.org/organic_production. We're very glad to have Bernadine Strik, David Bryla, and Handell Larco as our speakers today. In this webinar, they will discuss how the results of an organic blueberry production systems research study have provided insight on best planting methods, fertilization, irrigation, weed management, and economic considerations. I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers. Dr. Bernadine Strik is an extension berry crops professor in the Department of Horticulture at Oregon State University. She has been at OSU since 1987 and provides extension educational programs for the commercial berry crop industries. Bernadine is also the berry crop research leader at the North Willamette Research and Extension Center in Aurora, Oregon. David Brayla is a research horticulturist at the USDA Horticultural Crops Research Lab in Corvallis, Oregon. He has been with the USDA for 10 years and worked in Oregon since 2003. He does research on a variety of berry crops, including blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, strawberries, cranberries, and grapes. The overall goal of his research is to develop and evaluate new productive practices for growing these crops in the Pacific Northwest. Handell Larco is a Master of Science student from the Department of Horticulture and Business Administration at Oregon State University. He received an agricultural engineering degree in Ecuador, and his passion for organic agriculture brought him to Oregon to assist on research projects in berry crops. He has been primarily working with organic production systems of mature and newly established northern highbush blueberries since 2005. If you have a question for the speakers at any time during the webinar, just type your question into the question box on your screen and hit return. If the question box is closed, hit the small plus sign next to the word question to open it up. I will be reading the questions aloud and our speakers will answer them at the end of their 45-minute presentation. Okay, I'm now going to turn things over to you, Bernadine.
Thank you, Alice. Today, in this webinar, we're going to present results from the first 3 years of a research study on the effect of organic production systems on the establishment of highbush blueberry. We're going to give suggestions for planting establishment and management based on our preliminary findings and finish with conclusions and a summary of our ongoing work in this area. Although I've been interested in starting some organic production systems research, this organic project wouldn't have started without a request for organic blueberry research from the industry. Most of my research, at least at the beginning stages, is funded by commission or industry funds, and most of the dollars are collected for these commissions via assessments from conventional growers. So I started this project after their expression of interest by developing an advisory group which includes fellow researchers, industry leaders, both conventional and organic production systems growers, nursery, as well as handlers, both for fresh and processed fruit. We all met to discuss the project goals, objectives, industry needs, and then develop the treatments. The next step was developing possible sources of funding and proceeded to write the grants. In this webinar, as Alice introduced, Dave Bryla is going to discuss irrigation, and Handell Larco, a master's student working with me, is going to cover the weed management aspects and the costs. So here you can see the different members of our advisory board and then our collaborators. There was a large initial funding commitment from the Oregon Blueberry Commission. Without their support, this project couldn't have started. And then we successfully obtained federal funds from the Northwest Center for Small Fruit Research. The Washington Blueberry Commission wanted buy-in as their growers felt it was work that was relevant to their industry also. We received in-kind industry support from Eric Pond and Fall Creek Farm and Nursery, and then successfully obtained a longer-term federal funding from the NEFA Integrated Organic Production Grant. The objectives of this study were to establish a transitional and then a certified organic field, much like we expect most of the blueberry growers in this region would do. We wanted to determine the effect of raised beds on soil and plant water status, plant growth, of course yield, and then weed management. Study the different organic weed management systems for their effect on weed control as well as on blueberry plant growth. Study the effectiveness of different types and rates of organic fertilizers in 2 different cultivars, and then we kept track of all costs so that we could do an economic and establishment analysis for the establishment years. What I'd like to do is give you an idea of the different treatments that we had in this study. First of all, for planting method, we have raised bed production, which is by far the industry standard, and then flat ground, because we felt mechanical methods of weed control might be simpler in flat ground systems, but there hadn't been a research study to compare growth on raised and flat ground, especially in good soil. Then we have different types of organic fertilizer and rate. Now the types of fertilizer that we decided to use were based on trying to keep things simple, realizing that growers can use a compilation of different types of products. But we wanted to try and keep things simple and use 2 commonly used products, both feather meal and fish emulsion, which are common in the organic blueberry industry at this present time in this region. We based the rates that we were using during these establishment years on earlier work that we've done using inorganic fertilizer, where we've been able to monitor the uptake of fertilizer by young plants. And so these are considered to be on the low end at 25 pounds of nitrogen an acre, and then on the higher end at 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre. The feather meal, a more granular product, was applied around the plant, half in late winter and then half in April, May. And the fish emulsion was divided into 7 equal applications and applied as a liquid soil drench. We couldn't apply it through the drip in this study because of the nature of the plot design. The fish emulsion product that we used was Fish Agra from Northeast Organics. I do want to point out that this has a high salt content, or EC, at about 20. Blueberries aren't tolerant to this high salt, so we diluted it 10:1 before applying it to the plants. The feather meal product that we used was a nature-safe product. The cultivars that we're studying are Duke and Liberty, both very popular fresh season cultivars. The Duke is an early season variety, which is known for having a relatively higher nitrogen requirement, being a lower vigor plant. Liberty is a late season fresh market cultivar that is, at least in these initial stages, thought to be a more vigorous cultivar and may require less fertilizer nitrogen. And it would be interesting to compare an early and a late season cultivar. Weed management treatments considered our industry standard would be sawdust mulch with a hand weeding. The sawdust mulch was about 3 to 4 inches deep. The second treatment, organic mulch sandwich, as we'd like to call it, a compost, which was about 1 to 2 inches deep. This is a yard debris compost topped with sawdust, dug fir sawdust, about 2 inches deep. We have different products to use here for weed control, including a 20% acetic acid or vinegar solution, propane flaming, and then hand weeding if required. And then our final treatment is weed mat or landscape fabric with sawdust just based around the plants where the planting hole is. The 2 different organic products that we're using, our industry standard is Douglas fir sawdust. These are the prices when we established the planting. I know prices have gone up since then, but this was in fall of 2006. Typical pH is quite low for Doug fir sawdust, high CN carbon to nitrogen ratio, and relatively low boron, manganese, phosphorus. In contrast, the yard debris compost, pretty typical for this type of product, has a higher pH, a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio, and has a high phosphorus and high manganese. The experimental design is pretty standard for these cultivars, about in-row spacing of 2.5 feet in the row with 10 feet between rows for the planting density shown here. We are irrigating these plants with a single line drip tube, which is placed under the weed mat and under the mulch. Emitters are spaced at 1 foot and are half-gallon per hour emitters. You see an extra line here because we designed this planting with an extra line to be able to irrigate more under the weed mat if necessary. The planting is 1 acre in size. Looking at, just to show you what the plants looked like, the first growing season in 2007 and then the second growing season in 2008, comparing weed mat for flat ground and raised bed. So we had quite good growth in most of these treatments. But what we observed the first growing season was plants in particular that were fertilized with feather meal had what I thought were relatively obvious symptoms of nitrogen deficiency. When we sampled these plants here, they had a leaf tissue level of about 1.1 to 1.5% nitrogen in late June. In contrast, plants that were fertilized with fish emulsion did not show these same symptoms and had leaf tissue nitrogen concentrations that were more typical for this time of year. So what we decided to do was meet with the advisory group and give these plants an additional pulse of fish emulsion in order to hopefully rapidly improve tissue nitrogen levels. So the feather meal treatments in this first year, in addition to those rates of feather meal, they also got 3.5 pounds of nitrogen per acre applied as a soil drench of fish emulsion on each of 2 dates, in late June and in early July. And by tissue sampling time in early August, all of these treatments had tissue nitrogen concentrations in the normal range. So we were able to successfully improve plant nitrogen status even for the feather meal plots. And you can see here on the right we have a duke grown on sawdust flat ground receiving the low rate of feather and an additional fish emulsion, in comparison on the left, which received high rate of feather and fish emulsion. Both plants look quite good. At the end of the first growing season, we wanted to monitor plant growth by actually removing 1 plant per plot in each, in each plot. And what we did was we cleaned these plants of as much soil as possible and then divided the plants into their different parts: roots, crown, a 1-year-old wood, and then older wood and leaves, and then dried those plant parts down to assess plant growth. So when we're looking at assessing treatment effects, we're also actually looking at plant dry weight, including the roots. So when we look at total plant dry weight, Liberty plants were indeed more vigorous than Duke, which was what we expected, but they were considerably heavier. Plants fertilized with fish emulsion were also considerably heavier or larger than those fertilized with feather meal. And plants grown on flat ground were smaller than those on raised beds. Even after just 1 growing season in this relatively good soil, we saw a benefit of plants being grown on raised beds. In addition, when we look at the root system, Duke had a smaller root system than did Liberty. Also, fertilization with a high rate of fish emulsion ended up having plants that were kind of top-heavy. They had a large top compared to a relatively smaller root system. Going into the beginning of the second growing season, this shows the planting in April 2008, and we pruned plants in winter of the 2007-2008 to adjust each individual plant based on whether or not I thought it could produce a crop in the second growing season. So if a plant was relatively vigorous, had put on good growth, I pruned it to try and limit the crop to no more than ½ kilo per plant, or about a pound of fruit per plant. Whereas smaller plants that just weren't vigorous enough, pruned them so that they would not produce any fruit in 2008, year 2. We harvested fruit then from each plot, even though perhaps some plants in that plot were not vigorous enough to pick. And so we'd collect yield per plot data. One thing we noticed was that Duke, our early season cultivar, when it was grown on sawdust here, you can see relatively little ripe fruit still at the beginning of July. But in comparison, when Duke was grown on weed mat, here we are on the same date, we can see much more riper fruit. And so we found that weed mat actually advanced the season somewhat in Duke. In comparison, in our late season cultivar Liberty, here we see it on weed mat at the end of July, and here it is on sawdust on that same day, and we didn't really see a dramatic effect of weed mat on ripening season. One thing I do want to point out, though, is that in 2008, due to rain at bloom, we had relatively low or poor fruit set on Liberty, and this did limit yield. Looking at yield now, this table shows the treatment effects on yield, berry weight, and firmness. And what I'd like to do is talk you through some of our more significant findings. First of all, this does show yield in grams per plant. 500 grams is ½ kilo, and in this particular planting density, ½ kilo is about equivalent to 1 ton per acre. So you can see that even though I tried to target a ½ kilo per plant when pruning, due to some plants not being vigorous enough and relatively poor fruit set in Liberty, we didn't quite achieve that yield on our better treatments. First of all, looking at raised compared to flat ground. We had a significant higher yield on raised compared to flat in this second growing season, and that's a reflection of those plants simply being bigger at the end of the first growing season. When we look at the type of fertilizer and the rate of fertilizer, we had our best yield with the low rate of fish emulsion fertilizer. Looking at the organic compared to weed mat mulching, we had a significantly higher yield when plants were grown on weed mat in comparison to our industry standard of sawdust. And I think this again is a reflection of having a larger top on the weed mat plots. Liberty had a higher yield than Duke, even though fruit set was considered to be low in Liberty. No large effect on berry weight, as you can see here, but when we look at firmness, we saw some interesting things that we were wondering whether or not they'd be repeated in the third year. First of all, the high rate of fish emulsion significantly increased fruit firmness compared to the other nitrogen treatments. And we were real curious as to why this might be and to see if we could repeat that in the third year. The weed mat plots, however, had a trend, or significant here, excuse me, for having less firmness than the organic mulches. And Duke was firmer than Liberty, which is something we've observed in the industry. This graph shows the effect of mulch and fertilizer on tissue nitrogen concentrations at the end of July, a standard time for us to take tissue levels in blueberries. So this would be after harvest in the second year. And this graph here, the top line here, shows that a high rate of fish emulsion, the 50 pound per acre rate, had leaf concentrations that were above our standard recommendations, so indicating that perhaps this was too high a rate of nitrogen for this particular age of planting. In contrast, the two feather meal treatments here at the bottom in the dashed lines had tissue nitrogen concentrations that were below our standard levels, whereas the 25 pound per acre rate of fish emulsion ended up having recommended levels of tissue nitrogen. This slide here shows a plant with its leaves removed right before digging, again to look at plant growth. The leaves were removed and then leaf area was calculated. It's a nice way to look at plant architecture, however, and you can see here that on this Liberty plant that received the low rate of feather, after 2 growing seasons, the plant looks quite good. There are definitely quite a few fruiting laterals on many of these canes in here, and these would need to be thinned at pruning time to prevent overproduction and small fruit size. But we definitely had good growth after this second fruiting season. The next slide here shows Duke receiving a low fish emulsion rate, again with the leaves pulled off, and you can see we again have quite good plant growth with this low rate of fish emulsion. To give you an example of how plants grew after the second year, again this shows plant dry weight with the different plant parts. For the 2 low rates products, we have fish here and then feather emulsion, and then a feather meal, excuse me, and then we have the 2 high rates, feather meal and fish. The blue bar here is root growth, the red is the crown dry weight, green here is 1-year-old wood, and then here we have the 2-year-old, and finally the leaves. And so what was interesting again after the second year is that the high rate of fish emulsion reduced root growth and crown growth relative to a larger top, particularly the 2-year wood and the leaves were much larger in these plants. This graph shows the effect of growing season on plant dry weight. First of all, not surprising, after 1 growing season, plants were smaller here at the bottom than after 2 growing seasons, which shows these lines here at the top. But what is interesting is that after the second growing season, Duke here on the flat ground had the lowest dry weight and was not really very affected by the rate or the type of fertilizer. On raised beds here for Duke, the highest dry weight was with the 25 pound per acre of fish emulsion for Duke, and if we went with a higher rates of products, the plant growth actually declined. In contrast, Liberty here with these open diamond solid line here had the greatest dry weight when it was fertilized with the high rate here of fish emulsion, whereas on raised beds, this top line here, plants were larger but were less affected by the type of fertilizer or the rate of fertilizer. I do want to mention that Liberty plants had fewer whips or new whip growth when they were grown on weed mat than they were with organic mulches, which I'm not showing here but was an interesting result. Again, pruning in the winter of 2008 and 2009 was done to adjust the future crop based on vegetative growth, and again this was done on an individual plant basis. This shows the growth we had in the 3rd growing season for Duke with the low rate of feather meal. So when we went to harvest in 2009, the 3rd growing season, we followed standard commercial practice for harvest time. The picture here in the inset shows our Duke about 2 days before we set to pick. We wanted to ensure optimal fruit quality, and fruit were picked by hand, and we were selling fruit to the organic fresh market, so we wanted the fruit to be of optimal size, sweetness, and quality. Again, looking at yields, but this is time for the 3rd growing season in 2009. Again, after the second year of collecting yield data, raised beds were significantly higher yielding than flat ground, and this ½ kilo difference is equivalent to about 1 ton of fruit per acre, so it's pretty significant from a grower perspective, I would say. When we look at the fertilizer products, The 50 pound per acre rate of fish had a significantly lower yield than the 50 pound per acre of feather, which is shown here, and the 25 pound per acre fish. So our two best treatments were the higher rate of feather and the lower rate of fish. I do want to mention that the first application of feather in this third growing season was done much earlier because of the difficulty we had in the first growing season. So we decided to shift the application earlier to allow more time for that fertilizer to be made available to the plants with rainfall. Looking at the mulches, the industry standard of sawdust had a significantly lower yield than the weed mat and the sawdust plus compost sandwich. With berry size, we had significantly larger fruit on raised bed than flat ground. Also, we had Liberty fruit that were smaller than Duke, which is not unusual. With berry firmness, interestingly enough, again, the 50 pound per acre rate of fish emulsion significantly increased firmness compared to the other treatments. And the 25 pound per acre rate of feather meal had a lower firmness than the other treatments. So we are planning to do some additional work to determine why we might have increased firmness with the 50 pound per acre fish. It does produce a plant with more leaves and a higher yield, more leaves relative to fruit, so that might have some effect on the firmness, but this is something that we're interested in studying because now we've seen this 2 years in a row. Looking at Brix, this is a measure of the sweetness of the fruit or percent soluble solids. The significant findings we had in this third growing season were that the 25 pound per acre rate of feather had a lower Brix than the other treatments. We also saw weed mat reducing fruit sweetness compared to the organic mulches, and Liberty has significantly sweeter fruit than Duke, and this is something that you notice when you're eating the fruit. So again, we would like to try and determine why weed mat might have a higher percent soluble solids. We think it's related to either water status of the plant or a canopy temperature, and these are things that we plan to measure. So that's a summary of plant growth, and what I'd like to do is change the speaker over to Dr. David Bryla with the USDA-ARS, who's going to talk about irrigation effects in this particular planting.
Thank you, Bernadine. Do we have the next slide?
Okay, just one moment.
Okay, today I'm going to talk about irrigation in blueberries in general, and then show you some of the very interesting results we're seeing in this study with regards to irrigation. Now, for those of you not familiar with the Pacific Northwest, I know we all think of that area as a very rainy region. We have fairly dry summers in the Pacific Northwest, and without irrigation, blueberry production would be practically impossible. And next slide. Here is we go back up. Back 2 slides. Thank you. Here's a graph of precipitation in the 2007 from January to December, as well as what's called reference evapotranspiration, which is essentially the potential water use that a grass field would have. And it's used basically to determine what's the water use based on weather conditions. And what you can see that primarily between May and September, our growing season, there's very little rainfall during that time. And this is the time when water use by the plants is obviously the highest. So we require irrigation during this period. Next slide. Now, one thing to realize about blueberry is that it's not only a very finely rooted crop, it's very shallow rooted. Here is an example of some plants that we dug up back in 2005. We had 3 cultivars, Duke, Blue Crop, and Elliott, and we measured the amount of root length at various depths from 0 to 24 inches. And what this graph shows is, while there's differences among the cultivars, what's really interesting is that most of the roots tended to be located in the top foot of the soil, so it's very shallow rooted. Consequently, this plant is very sensitive to water limitations. Next slide, please. Within a few days, without rain or irrigation in our area, water stress develops quickly in blueberry plants. You may not visibly see it, but you can certainly measure it. And some of the things that happens quickly without irrigation or without sufficient irrigation is, first, the plants begin to have reduced photosynthesis. So they're fixing less carbon, having less energy available for growth, and that ultimately results in lower yields and lower fruit quality. Next slide. It's also important to realize, however, that you can't simply apply water willy-nilly to blueberries. Blueberries are also very sensitive to over-irrigation. If you apply too much water to blueberries, it causes the roots not to function very well in either water or nutrient uptake. You also have problems with nutrient leaching, and perhaps if you have sloped fields, some soil erosion. And we found in some cultivars that you have higher incidence of root rot. And in young plants in particular, if you apply too much water, you can actually kill many of the plants in your field. Next slide, please. Now, most commercial fields in Oregon are irrigated by one of 2 methods, and this is pretty much true for the entire United States. Fields are either irrigated by sprinklers, and a survey done in 2001 showed that about 90% of the commercial fields in Oregon were irrigated by sprinklers. And the other method, which is becoming more popular, particularly if you go to British Columbia or Washington or California, is the use of drip. Usually, depending on the method and the weather conditions, water is applied about every 1 to 7 days as needed, and typically we apply about 1 to 2 inches of water per week. Next slide. Now, for organic blueberries, as Bernadine had showed some of the treatments that we had. We have the flat beds and the raised beds and the weed mat versus the sawdust. Now, it's easy to imagine that if you were to use sprinklers in an organic system, you'd have a lot more weeds than you would with drip. So it makes sense to go with drip in an organic system where weed control is very important in terms of managing the field. So we irrigated this field, as Bernadine mentioned, with a single line of drip in most plots, although we had a second line on the weed mat for reasons that I'll show you in a few seconds. But we had a couple questions in this particular study. Were there any differences in the water requirements, whether the plants were growing on flat ground or in raised beds, and was there any differences between the sawdust and the weed mat? Next slide. Here are some pictures of some slides of some data that Handell had taken in 2007 on soil water content. On the left is a graph of the raised beds for each of the 3 weed control treatments, either sawdust and compost, or the weed mat. And on the right is flat ground. And basically, not surprisingly, we saw that soil water content tended to be lower on raised beds and flat ground. This was particularly true under the weed mat. And you can see in that left slide how low the soil moisture was in the weed mat treatments relative to the sawdust and the sawdust compost. Well, Handell quickly realized that plants were under-irrigated with the weed mat treatment. So in early July of that first year, he started to control his irrigations based on soil water content measurements and adjusted it, the amount of water he was applying to the weed mat relative to the sawdust, as well as the amount he was applying to the raised beds and the flat ground. You can see in Liberty in July 27th of 2007 that we developed some symptoms of water stress under the weed mat treatment. He measured the soil water content using what's called a TDR, a time domain reflectometry system. And he had a probe essentially that was buried from the top 12 inches of the soil. Next slide. So we had some questions. Why was the soil water content lower on the raised beds than on the flat ground? Well, that's basically the whole reason of doing a raised bed, is to increase drainage, improve aeration, so that you don't have problems with root diseases, and you have more oxygen available for good root function. So this essentially is what's happening here is when you have a raised bed, it holds less water. So that means you need to apply water, maybe not more water necessarily, but water more frequently than you would to a flat ground. Now in the weed mat conditions, however, typically you think if you cover a soil surface with weed mat, you have less evaporation. But here we're comparing sawdust to weed mat. Sawdust will also reduce soil evaporation. So essentially what's happening now is differences in temperature between the weed mat and the sawdust. Next slide. So here's an actual graph between July 11th and 13th in 2007 of the weed mat treatments on raised beds and flat ground versus the sawdust treatments on raised beds and flat ground. So these were daily measurements taking every hour, plotted over time. And what you can see that the daily pattern was that the weed mat treatments were significantly warmer than the sawdust treatments. So essentially what's happening is the weed mats are increasing that soil temperature. They're also increasing the temperature in the canopy. Basically the sunlight reflects off that weed mat plastic and consequently warms the canopy. Well, when that happens, the plant ends up using more water. It has a higher rate of transpiration, we call it. And when plants use more water, of course, then they need more irrigation. So the reason we're seeing higher water use with the weed mat treatments or higher water requirements with the weed mat was due to soil and canopy temperatures. Next slide. So here's the actual water use that we applied to those plants. Handell was managing the irrigation these first 2 years, and here we have the weed mat on raised beds versus the sawdust and sawdust compost on average on the raised beds. And you can see that weed mat basically on average increased the irrigation requirements by 97 gallons per plant over the course of the growing season. Next slide. The following year, Handell did a much better job after he understood what was going on managing the soil water applications in the field. And you can see here on the left we have measurements taken on raised beds with a shorter probe. Here it was only in the top 6 inches, and on the right is with the probe he used the previous year, the top foot of the soil, the top 12 inches. And you see that there's much less difference this year between the sawdust, the weed mat, and the sawdust compost treatment in terms of the soil water content. So irrigation was scheduled based on his water measurements. And what he found was that in these young plants, as you remember, these plants are very shallow rooted, it was better to monitor in the 0 to 6 inches than the 0 to 12 inches for controlling his irrigations. Next slide. Here we have then the irrigation that second year on the flat ground on the left versus the raised beds for the weed mat versus the sawdust and the sawdust compost. And what we found was that raised beds increased the irrigation requirements by about 49 gallons per plant compared to the flat beds. And again, weed mat increased the irrigation requirements by 78 gallons per plant this year, which is a little bit less than the previous year. The third year, similar measurements were taken, and essentially that difference decreased even more. So what we think is happening that now that the canopy is getting bigger, shading more of that weed cloth, we have less of a temperature difference between the sawdust and the weed mat treatment. So consequently, the water use difference is less than it was in the first 2 years. Next slide. So in summary, some of the interesting things that we've been finding in blueberries over the years is that, of course, blueberry is a shallow-rooted crop and is very sensitive to water stress. Now, we suggest using drip irrigation for organic production simply because it leads to less problems with weeds. We found that 1 irrigation line per row was adequate so far with for the first 3 years. However, maybe a second line might be needed later on. We did have that second line for the weed mat, but that was more of a treatment control rather than the actual requirements of the plant. We found, very importantly, that plants required more water on raised beds than on flat ground, and that plants required more water with the weed mat than with the sawdust mulch. Next, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Handell Larco, who's going to talk about weed management and the cost of establishment of the study.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Well, as Dave mentioned, the drip irrigation is better to control weeds on organic production system. However, we also wanted to see if which one of the treatments that we set as a mulch will be better for the weed management and its cost in a 2-year period. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to recall about the weed treatments that Bernadine mentioned earlier, we had 3 mulch treatments. The first one was the sawdust mulch plus hand weeding. The second one was the compost plus sawdust mulch, and initially we set up the treatment to have flaming, applying during the spring, which will be the use of a propane device, and the acetic acid with a 20% concentration will be applied during the summer. If those treatment options wouldn't work, we will go ahead and use hand weeding. Similar for the weed mat, we apply some sawdust around the holes, and if we need it, we will go with hand weeding into the plots. The methodology, when I say if we need it or not, what determined that was we set a threshold of 25%. We will go through the field and evaluate every 3 weeks with 2 different methodologies. The first one was this square that you can see into the bottom of the right of your screens. So that one, it was to give us an idea of how big the weeds will represent in a plot. And the other treatment that we used, the other methodology that we used, was a visual percent analysis per plot. So we'll go and rate every plot to see the weeds percentage. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we have in the smaller picture, we had how the weeds would look after the application of vinegar. That will be 1 day after. Usually we could see that we needed to apply the vinegar, and it has to be followed for at least 4 to 5 hours of intense sunlight to have this type of effect on the next day. Next one. Yeah, and okay, and here we can, sorry. Okay, well, we also did the hand weeding, and sometimes, you know, we will go through the field, do the hand weeding on the plots that the vinegar was not effective, or in the plots that needed it, and take them out of the field. Next one, please. I'm going to talk about the results that we see in the plots. Okay, so here we have, well, that was the threshold, the top line at the 25%. This is the visual rating of the plots, and the arrows are going to show how the weed treatments will be applied in different dates based on what it was needed, right? So in 2007, we could see that sawdust and compost had the most incidence of weeds per plot, and it was also we also found that the weed mat plots will have the lesser impact of weeds. It will be very good to control weeds. However, in 2008, we could see that the weed mat plots will have a little bit more incidence. However, most of that incidence were for annual bluegrass, which are small weeds, and we just wanted to control them. In 2008, we can see with the yellow arrows, we used the flamer during the spring, and we could see that it was not very efficient, and yeah, we could see it was not very efficient, and whereas the vinegar was very efficient to control mostly annual weeds. It was hard to control perennial weeds, and in the sawdust plots, well, we'll go and do the hand weeding, which will help a lot to control the weeds there. Next slide, please. Okay, here are some pictures of the most common weeds we found. The picture on the upper right side of the screen, it was a curly dog weed. It was a big weed right there. At some point, you know, that could be a growth within 3 to 6 weeks. Probably we skipped that one and didn't do the hand weeding, and that's the effect of what could happen. That could definitely affect the growth of whips. Next slide, please. So we did an analysis of all the weeds we had present in the field. Next slide, please. It's taking. Can I go to the next slide, please? Well, so yeah, the weeds with the green letters. Sorry, can I go back to slides, please? Well, I just wanted to mention in the slide before that we had a list of the perennial weeds, curly dog, quaggrass. Quaggrass was a hard weed to control, as you might know, and the best way to hit that weed was like definitely hand weeding. Do not let the quaggrass grow in the rhizomes, and also it was easy to control the annual weeds, shepherd's purse, lady's thumb, and hairy vetch with either with the vinegar or hand weeding. Well, I'm going to talk about the costs, about the weed management. So in this slide, you are going to see the installation costs per treatment of different mulch treatments we have here. So we had the flatbeds was about, to set up the treatments, usually the raised beds were more expensive than the flat ground. And as you can see here, the cost per acre in the sawdust plots, and we are going to see from the compost plus sawdust and the installation of the weed mat. So clearly here the compost plus sawdust was more expensive because of the material, and in the weed mat plots we can see the material, which was $1,200 per acre, and we amortized in a 5-year period. Then we have installation costs. We have the cutting holes. Well, we didn't have much experience cutting the holes, so that could be a high cost that could be reduced in an open field. And then we had the planting costs. So I'd like to go for the next slide. Okay, and here we have how long it took us to control the different treatments. Okay, so we had the sawdust. It took us 7 hours per acre. In the compost plus sawdust, during the first year, we had 5 applications of acetic acid, which was 25 hours per acre, adding 2 people, right? Because we will apply this with a tractor and with a spot spraying. And with the product, it will be $13 each application, which totals $67 of product per acre. And since that was not enough to control the weeds, we will go ahead and start doing the hand weeding, which was about 3 hours per acre. Then we had the weed mat, 3 hours per acre. So we had the total cost here per 1 year. We have sawdust, $100 per acre. Compost plus sawdust was the most expensive here in the first year because of the vinegar application, and the weed mat required minimum hand weeding. In the next slide, I'm going to show the second year, which increased for most of the treatments, for all of them eventually. So for sawdust, it was 19 hours, and then compost plus sawdust, in the second year, we used the flamer, and that was about 10 hours, and decreased the amount of vinegar applications to only 1 because the incidence of weeds was relatively lower, and also we will know, like, we can let some weeds grow and then go through the field and do the hand weeding, which could have a more positive impact because we will already know which type of weeds will be like perennial or annual weeds. And we know so far that the vinegar won't be too effective on the perennial weeds. In the next slide, I just want to summarize what has been so far the total costs per plot. So in the sawdust, we had a total of $390 per acre, and sawdust plus compost, $984, and in the weed mat, $709. In the weed mat plots, we are considering, as you can see in this chart, in the weed mat plots, we are considering the hand weeding plus $242 each year for depreciation costs. And so with the green color in the green bar, you can see the hand weeding of 2 years, and so that's required the most. And in the compost plus sawdust, you can see that we spent about $700 only on different weed controls, such as vinegar and flamer. I think that will be the end of my presentation, and I'm going to go back with Bernadine, she's going to give a summary with recommendations for the entire study.
Thank you, Handell. So in summary, raised beds have improved plant growth, particularly new growth or top growth, yield, and berry size so far in this study. Also, I want to point out that the more typical industry practice is to incorporate an organic product. Here it's commonly sawdust before planting. And in a separate study, we've shown that this usually increases irrigation requirement simply because it increases the drainage in the raised bed or soil porosity, which Dave Bryla mentioned earlier. However, in this study, our soil was quite good with 3 to 4% organic matter, and our advisory board, we all agreed that we shouldn't incorporate sawdust before planting. And despite that, even without incorporation of sawdust, we are seeing raised beds requiring more irrigation water than flat ground. Weed mat has increased top growth relative to root growth and subsequently has increased yield. It's also advanced the season in an early cultivar like Duke so far. Weed mat has been the most effective weed management tool, but the economics relative to organic mulches still needs to be determined because we don't know the life of the weed mat quite yet, but as Handell mentioned, it looks quite good so far. Vinegar and flaming, which have been affected in the right conditions, have to be used with caution because you can injure the blueberry plant. Certainly if you do flaming in the hot summer, your sawdust or product, whatever, could catch fire. Not a good thing. We have confirmed that young plants don't need much fertilizer nitrogen in our soil. In fact, the 25 pound of nitrogen per acre fish emulsion treatment has been the best so far. Fish fertilizer has been quickly available to the plants, but comes at a high cost. Feather meal hasn't been as good so far as the fish, and fertilizer seems to be affecting fruit quality, so this is something that we would like to look at further. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to do is give you a quick idea of our ongoing work. We do plan to adjust fertilizers based on the crop needs or requirements as the bushes age, and we want to diversify the products as necessary to make it more typical of what organic growers might have in their palette of available fertilizers. We are continuing to monitor plant growth, irrigation needs, weeding requirements, yield, fruit quality, and production costs, and so we'll be developing some extension tools for growers when we learn more about these aspects of the study. And also we're monitoring soil nutrient availability, root development, and plant nutrient uptake. As a side study, Dr. Dan Sullivan is working with a student, Ryan Costello, to develop a custom compost for blueberry that has a low pH and a low salt content. And finally, we're evaluating the potential of applying fish fertilizer through the drip system, commonly called fertigation. We're doing this in a new trial with organic blackberries that we're about to start.
Thank you, Bernadine, David, and Handell. We're now going to take some questions from our listeners, and I'd like to repeat for any listeners who might have missed the beginning of the webinar that if you have a question, you can type it into the question box on your screen and hit return. And if the question box is closed, just hit the small plus sign next to the word question to open it up. So I'll read out the questions, and we'll answer as many of them as we have time for. We have about 20 minutes. So the first question that came in is there a relationship between micronutrient deficiencies and mummyberry susceptibility?
I'll take that question. Susceptibility to mummyberry is predominantly a genetic trait, and so there are cultivars that differ in sensitivity to monilinia or mummyberry, but there's been no research that I'm aware of that has related plant nutrient status, whether macro or micronutrients, and sensitivity to this disease. And granted, it's not an easy disease to control in organic production systems.
Okay, the next question is, does it matter what type of wood you use in your sawdust?
Does it matter? In terms of the species of plant, I guess the short answer would be yes, because yard debris compost is mainly wood chips of different yard-type plants, or the most common type woody material in yard debris compost, and includes grass clippings and those types of things too. So some wood products have a higher pH than others, and if they're composted might have a higher salt content than others. What I suggest all growers do, conventional or organic, is if they're planning to use a new product, is to have it tested to determine the pH, the EC or salt status, and the carbon to nitrogen ratio can differ a lot between different products. It can be based on not only the type of wood used, but the size of the particle size of the material, and all of that is tied to fertilizer requirements, particularly the propensity or likeliness of that organic mulch to immobilize nitrogen. So these are key things that need to be determined.
Okay, can you use the flame weed control near the weed mat, or will it destroy it?
Oh, definitely that would destroy the weed mat. We never use the flamer in the weed mat. The weed mat is very, very, very thin. It'll definitely burn it.
Okay. Two questions about planting. How were the planting holes prepared, and how many feet were the raised beds above the flat ground?
The planting holes were pretty standard. We plant our plants, they're typically at what would be called a 2-year-old plant, which is a 1-gallon size container, and they're dug, the holes are, the beds or flat ground are all prepared before planting, so the entire row is ready to plant. The plants intended plant spacing is marked with stakes, in this case 2.5 foot center to center, and then the holes are dug with a shovel before planting. The plant is put at the soil level of the nursery plant, is level with the soil of either the flat ground or the raised bed, and then the mulch is applied on top of that. With regard to the size of the raised beds, they do settle over time. They were approximately 12, they settled to approximately 12 inches high, and they're about a little over 1.5 foot at the top, and then they angle, they're flat at the top, and then they angle down at the sides.
What is the purpose of the white plastic pipes in the rows?
Dave, do you want to take that one? I think that's for the mini rhizotron.
Yeah, those white plastic pipes are basically what they are. They're covers for some clear plastic tubes that we have installed in the field. This is part of the study where we're looking at root production in the plant. So we have a camera that we can actually install in those tubes at different depths and go back to those same locations time and time again, so we can monitor when the roots are being produced and how long they're living. So essentially, those white caps are just covering those clear plastic tubes.
What direction are your rows running?
The rows run north-south, which is pretty standard for our industry.
Okay, and someone had a question about the best time of year to plant blueberry.
The best time of year to plant blueberries varies with region here in North America. Commonly in milder regions or temperate regions, fall planting has become the most common. We planted ours in early October, which is pretty common. We feel that since the risk of cold injury is quite small or non-existent pretty much, and it allows more root growth prior to bud break the following season, we would still call the following year the first growing season in that scenario. But in some colder regions, plants are planted in the spring if they feel there is risk to winter injury.
Let's see, okay, you answered this question, Handell, but somebody wanted to know what the main weeds we deal with are in the Pacific Northwest, and would the same weed treatments be viable in the Midwest?
Well, I'm not really sure about the weeds in the Midwest, but I will say one of the toughest weed to control here is perennial quackgrass. It's a very, very nasty weed, I can tell, and it propagates. It extends propagates by the rhizomes and extends all the root system underground in below the sawdust mulch. So it's very hard to control that one. I will say that will be the toughest weed if you have that weed on your field. And then other than that, the annual weeds are okay. We can control them easier with the vinegar or just hand weeding. And if you have something like curly dog, that one has a deep tab root, so it's hard to control it once it starts growing. Yeah.
Okay, someone asked whether acetic application is used as a foliar treatment rather than a soil drench.
Alice, can you repeat what application?
The vinegar application.
Oh.
Okay, go ahead, Handell.
No, sorry, did I say, could you repeat the question?
Okay, somebody wrote in if whether the acetic acid application is used as a foliar treatment or a soil drench.
Oh, it was a spot spraying, so it would be like a foliar. The vinegar will be used as a contact herbicide, pretty much. Yeah, so it would be foliar.
Okay. Someone asked about sawdust and whether you're referring to wood chips or actually sawdust and what the differences are.
The sawdust that we're referring to is a genuine sawdust. wood chips is technically, could also be called a sawdust, but the chips are larger. So I don't have off the top of my head what the particle size is of this sawdust, but you know, we're looking at a 1/4 inch or smaller for this Doug fir sawdust, whereas wood chips generally we're looking at, you know, a 1/2 inch or larger. It takes much longer to break down in our climate. Our sawdust typically we expect with our rainfall pattern, which is about 40 inches of rain falling between October and mid-June, we lose about an inch of sawdust a year as the surface mulch decomposes in our climate with that particle size.
One person commented that one maybe could use the flamer for cutting holes, and also said that asked whether Canadian thistle is an annual.
Well, I think we use something like worm to cut the holes, and that was definitely, I think, if you done it, I think that would be the best way to go, because that also kind of seals the holes around the weed mat. And also, well, yeah, I think that Canadian thistle, yeah, that's an annual weed.
Okay. What about disease incidence and management? Are there any concerns with aphid management to prevent scorch?
I'll take that one. We do not have blueberry scorch prevalent in blueberries in Oregon. It is a concern in northern, well, certainly in British Columbia. It's a big concern, and in the eastern part of the U.S. it is indeed aphid-borne. Certainly we wouldn't want high aphid populations in this planting. We have observed the occasional aphid. However, we have also a lot of predators, particularly ladybird, beetle larvae, and we have not to date applied any fungicide or bactericide product like copper or lime sulfur, nor have we applied any insecticide. We may have to change that practice this year, as we do plan to trap for spotted wing Drosophila, which is present at this research station, and if needed we will apply organically approved insecticides and baits to control that pest. But we do not have some of the prevalent pests like Japanese beetle or blueberry maggot that are present in the east.
Okay, can you repeat the timing for the fish fertilizer, please?
The fish fertilizers were applied in 7 equal split applications, and that occurred about every 2 weeks from April, which is pre-bloom for us, just slightly before bloom, until about mid-July, which is early part of harvest for Duke.
Okay. Let's see. Are there any suggestions for a late spring planted cover crop for aisle cover, which can hold up to foot traffic and which would be tilled in annually?
I'm sure there are quite a few products that could be used. The reason we don't have annual cover crops being used much by our industry is because we need a product there during both the growing season to minimize dust for fruit harvest, as well as in the winter to allow foot traffic when we're pruning. So we actually, our growers most commonly use a perennial, and what we have in this particular planting is a combination of meadow fescue and perennial ryegrass, and it just doesn't grow during our dry summer months, so we don't need to mow it very frequently because, of course, this is a drip irrigated plot, and having a grass like this between the rows is quite common for our blueberry growers.
Can you comment on soil pH and prepping the ground prior to planting? This is especially of concern to eastern Washington growers and relevant in light of the addition of sulfur burners to the national list of approved substances?
Okay, our natural soil pH in an unadulterated, that is a natural type of soil that hasn't had lime applied in the past it ranges from about pH 5 to pH 5.6. So in an ideal world here in the Willamette Valley, no sulfur addition is required before planting. The soil that we had for this plot was no different than that. The pH of this soil was 4.9 before planting, and the organic matter content was almost 4%. So we did not need to incorporate anything before planting. With regard to the question, yes, the soils in eastern Washington are, most regions in eastern Washington have a high pH soil. Many growers would be applying elemental sulfur before planting with the goal of reducing the pH to the acceptable range of anywhere between 4.5 and 5.5. However, many soils that have a pH above 6 and in the type of growing conditions that some of these regions have with rainfall patterns, etc., cannot apply enough elemental sulfur to lower the pH to make it suitable for blueberries. So in most of these production regions, which would include the Central Valley of California and eastern Washington, the irrigation water must be acidified in addition to any pre-plant treatment in order to have the soil solution be at a pH that's acceptable for blueberries. And most organic growers are using either acetic acid, organically approved acetic acid injection systems, or citric acid injection systems to be able to do that.
Okay, were there any weeds that were affected by flaming, and was flaming done with tractor-pulled equipment or by handheld equipment?
Sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Yes, whether there were any weeds that were affected by flaming, and whether flaming was done with tractor-pulled equipment or handheld.
Well, the weeds were pulled only by hand, and that's what we did the most. So we did not use machinery for the weeds control. And also, I want to clarify. Yeah, I had this in my slides. I mentioned Canada thistle as an annual weed, and no, it is a perennial weed. And even though, that one is a hard to control weed, but we did not have as much as incidence as a perennial weed. So, just to clarify that one for a question earlier.
Okay.
Alice, insert a comment here in terms of. And the growers listening need to understand that, this is a 1-acre plot, but planting, but each treatment plot is relatively small. And so, we fully understand that if we find a production system treatment that works, whether it's vinegar application or flaming, for example, then we expect growers, as innovative as they are, to develop machinery in order to be able to do this on a much larger scale. So while we may have to do things by hand, they may be able to come up with mechanical means to do these if they're effective.
Okay, thank you, Bernadine. We are running out of time. We have a lot more questions, so I just wanted to say to those people who haven't gotten their questions answered that we will follow up with you after the webinar, and we'll do that by email. And I'd like to thank you for joining us for this webinar. And if there's anything that you missed or you'd like to hear it again, or if you'd like to share the links with others, the webinar was recorded and it will be available along with all the slides on the eOrganic website at the link on the screen, www.extension.org/organic_production. And on that website you can also find out about our upcoming webinars. Thank you again, Bernadine, Handell, and David, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.